Sanibonani. Ngiyajabula ukuthola le thuba ukuthi ngethulele inkulumo yabona abafuzwayo. Ngizwe la. Angazi ke ngoba mina inkulumo yami ibhalwe ngolimi lwesilungu. Kodwa ngizocela kumahlabezulu ukuthi ngizwe ukuthi singaqhubeka kanjani. Ngaqhubeka ngaso isilungu noma ngaqhubeka esindebeleni. Isindebele sami naso ngathi sesiyabaleka. Themba liyasizwa sesingathi sichebana kakhulu lesisu. Sikhuluma isiZulu lapha esiphila khona ngoba kuyindlela yokuzama ukuthi siphile. Bangasibona abantu bangasheshi ukusizwa ukuthi lo ulimi lwakhe luyabaleka. So mase sibuya lana sikhuluma isiZulu akusukuthi siyasenzisa. Kodwa kuyindlela esiphila ngayo sizonke ngoba namanje ngiyabuyela ngimangibuyela akumelanga ngifike sesithi sengihlanganisa ukuthi izinto zikwanele ngingazikwana. Bazosheshe babuza ukuthi yini. So ngaleso sizathu ke sisingabantu abaphila becashile. Mhlawumbe bona ukuphila sicashile bona lokho kusukela kuso isimo sethu njengesizwe. Kungani kanti vele singadlala ngekhaya? Kungani singadlali labantu abethe ekhaya? Sizikhulumela isindebele noma isikhalanga noma isivela noma isinampiya. Njengokwezwa ngabanye abantu kwezinye izizwe. Imibuzo ekumele iphendulwe. Isihloko sami namhlanje besithi sona victims or victors. A reflection on the life and legacy of Lookout Khalisa Bantu Vumindaba Masuku. So the question is, did he live his life as a victor or he lived and died as a victim? How do you see it yourself? What was he? I don't purport to have the answers to the question, but I raise this question just to provoke your reflection. It's rhetorical in its sense. It is actually inviting you to think about it. Did Lookout Masuku live and die as a victor, or he lived and died as a victim? So if he was a victim, then the question would be, whose victim was he? Who victimized him? But if he was a victor, then against whom did he score that victory? So you will find that then this becomes a case of a mixed legacy, where on the one hand we celebrate him as the general who ushered this new Zimbabwe into what it became. So we are here saying, if Lookout Masuku had not gone out to fight the struggle, this thing we call Zimbabwe today would not have been there. I speak to exaggerate his role. I appreciate the role of every war veteran seated here. Maybe I should have begun by taking off my hat and greeting every war veteran who is gathered here this morning. Good morning, Boba Wanabo Mama, Balwe Benkululego, Sanibonani. Yes. There is this controversy sometimes when we talk about the liberation of Zimbabwe, that we single out names, especially the names of the commanders, and we portray the whole image as if Mr. Ziapapa J, Mr. Mangena Alfred, or Mr. Lookout Masuku, or Mr. Josato Ngogara are the ones who delivered the independence in this country. And so sometimes you find that the role played by the runners is often forgotten. And that is the sad legacy of this country, because if I could digress a little bit and say, by the time the Lancaster House Conference was held in 1979, I was at the age of 7. But I have had my own run-ins and my own experiences with the Zipra, because they are the ones who operated in my area. I met them many times. We housed them many times. And we prepared meals for them many times. In my own homestead. My mother, my grandmother, my grandfather, everybody was involved there. And even some of the battles that were fought, I did experience some of them from my home. There are two that I remember very well, but maybe the one that I can talk about, which some of us here might know about. I'm sure you know about a bombing at a village somewhere in Majiji, sometime in 1979. How many of you have heard about that? I personally witnessed that from a distance. I was about 7. I could see those, those aircraft dropping their bombs and so on, and smoke coming up and so on. So the war was fought by Mr. Lookout Masuku, the war veterans, and everybody else. But today we talk about him singularly because he was at the top, especially after the passing away of Mr. Alfred Lee. I'm sorry to be using the words Mr. I know they've got their own names in the struggle, especially in the military. But the passing away of Nikita Mangena, whose wife sadly passed away barely 2 weeks ago in near poverty, without any provision, without any honor, for the sacrifice that she and her husband did. But the death of Skuvegiso Mangena in a proper state is hardly surprising in a country where a lot of heroes and heroines go unsung and unrecognized. And this is one of the things that were raised by Mr. Lookout Masuku in a letter that he wrote to the Prime Minister Robert Mugabe in 1980, sometime in September. If you may allow me just to scan through that letter and read some of the words that Mr. Lookout Masuku said. He said somewhere, this letter had several paragraphs, but there is this particular paragraph where he was talking about how the legacy of the struggle was being, sidetracked, whereby he was talking about the ZBC, then how it was not paying attention to that paragraph 4, the letter says, radio broadcasts give an impression that our full and well-known participation in the struggle to liberate our country is neither appreciated nor recognized. For example, only Zanda and Chimurenga songs are played, a development which affects cohesion in the army and is indeed out of step with the spirit of national reconciliation. Now, this letter was written in 1980. And by 1980, Mr. Lookout Masuku was already saying to the Prime Minister, the sidelining of the history and the contribution of Zipra and Zapu in the struggle is disconcerting and concerning, because it gives an impression that only Zanda fought and Zipra did not fight. So, when we talk about Lookout Masuku, we are talking about a visionary. We are talking about somebody who could see trouble coming as early as 1980. When you take time to read this letter, you really wonder if this man had prophetic insight and prophetic wisdom. Because he raises questions about what kind of a nation we will build if the integration process means just grafting members of one military wing or group into another. Because he talks here in this letter about the troubles of Zipa in the late 1970s, how Zipper had been an attempt to erase Zipra, and while just integrating them into Zanla and eventually creating an army that would just be predominantly Zanla with just a few outcrops of Zipra elements here and there, coming not as equals but coming to join an establishment. So these are the questions that Mr. Lookout Masuku raised in his letter to the Prime Minister. And you see, when you read through this letter, because it's one of those most authoritative sources, we have not really come across many of his writings by him or any speeches by him, but this letter gives us just a sneak peek into the kind of man that he was, what his views were, what his dreams were, what his aspirations were. So in one of the paragraphs he says that the building or the construction of an army, especially through an integration exercise that they were confronted with, he did point out that it would not just be a matter of crafting in a few Zipra elements into the Zanda, because he said he did not believe in the absorption of one military by another. As we will remember that at the Lancaster House Conference we had 3 armies which, according to the Lancaster House Agreement, would then have to be integrated into one national force, into one national army. But as early as 1980, Mr. Lookout Masuku raised flags about how the construction of this national army under British instructor was already being politicized. He cited and emphasized and outlined the dangers of the politicization of the army, because he could foresee that an army that had been politicized would not give allegiance to the people of Zimbabwe, but would also only give allegiance to those who had politicized it. So that was the matter of concern, which was highlighted by Mr. Masuku in 1980. And still on that note, you might ask yourself a very critical question. I'm sure you may have heard some speculative suggestions by some people saying that Zimbabwe does not have a national army, but Zimbabwe just continued with a ZANU militia from 1979 into present-day Zimbabwe, just taking on a few elements from the Rhodesian Front and from Zipra, just throwing them in there. But predominantly, in terms of structure, personnel, and ideology, and allegiance, it is arguable that it is not exactly a national army, but it is a militia for a particular political organization. Now, to give credence to that kind of speculative thought is the idea that sometime in 2008, when it had become apparent that Morgan Tsvangirai might win the presidency, there were some elements within the army who openly said, even if you win, we will not salute you. So then that raises questions about the allegiance of the army. Is it towards the people of Zimbabwe, or it is towards the establishment? If it is towards the people of Zimbabwe, that's a very great thing to congratulate. But if there are any concerns, as they are, and if those concerns are not misplaced, then surely questions about the legitimacy of the operations of our army would need to be looked into by every citizen, because it matters to the citizen to whom the army is answerable. It must be answerable to the people, not to an establishment. Because in some civilized countries, when a government comes in, the army gives allegiance. When the government is voted out, another one comes in, they give allegiance to the new one. That's how this transition is supposed to take place. So, but as it is, Mr. Masuku was already concerned in 1980 that this army was being politicized, and therefore there was a risk that it would not be, it would not owe allegiance to the people, it would not give its support and loyalty to the people, but rather it would give loyalty to those that had constituted it. So those concerns were raised as early as 1980. Whether they were any grounds, solid grounds, and reasonable grounds for such fears and concerns, I will leave it for you to decide. But that's one area where people need to think very broadly. Because unless there are assurances about, unless we are clear about who the army is answerable to, then questions of elections and winning elections become a non-starter. Because at the end of the day, one question that has always been asked is, suppose they like you, the people of Zimbabwe love you so much, they vote overwhelmingly, 99% for you. Are there assurances that transition will be given to you? And since transition would also involve handing over the military authority to the new incumbent, do you stand qualified to receive it, especially if you are outside the structures of the current establishment? Those are questions that need to be asked and to be answered. Because without any such assurances, all political activity is just an exercise in vain, because it will not yield any result. Remember, at the end of the day, when you have been chosen or elected, you must assume office. So the question is, will you be able to assume office? I sometimes think that most of our debates, they put around voter education, getting people ramping up to support, go vote, and so on. But what about these very key, important decisions to say, in the event that you have got it, in the event that people have voted for you, are you assured that you will be ushered in? Will you be given the support that you need? Will you be given the authority to inspect the guard of honor without any fear about what might happen to you? Especially if you have to inspect a guard of honor that may not give allegiance to you. Those are some of the critical questions that I think we should be reflecting on. So we say, look out, Masuku. Was he a victor or was he a victim? Still thinking about the events, I just spoke about the letter that he wrote in 1980 and the concerns that he had. He actually noticed that there were allegations that there were some Zipra elements who were dissidents somewhere in different parts of the country. And there were also similar allegations that there were some Zanda dissidents operating in different parts of the country. So he actually said in the letter that Zipra tried their best to apprehend any dissidents breaking away from Zipra. And they had even had some of them incarcerated and becoming prisoners for all. But he raised concern that their Zanda counterparts who also had dissidents were not doing anything to capture them and maybe get them prosecuted through the normal legal process and so on. Those are the questions that he raised. And he also raised the questions to do with the fact that whilst the agreement, the joint command agreement, that is the joint command of the three forces that would then be integrated into one, whilst there was an agreement that they should not be sending any personnel out for training, there was a concern that one of the three was still sending out personnel to do some military training outside the country. And Mr. Lookout Masuku questioned why that was the case. And that was as early as 1980. And so, as we all know, the integration process progressed the way it did. And then it got to a point where there were allegations here and there. But one would say as soon as ZIPRA were disbanded, that's when it became easy to arrest the supremos of ZIPRA, throw them into prison on allegations of treason, put them through a lengthy trial process, which went right through to the most supreme court in the country. And then in 1983, the Supreme Court of Appeal said it did not find any, there was no evidence. That in other words, the state could not prove beyond reasonable doubt that Lookout Masuku, Dumiso Dabengwa, and the others who were arrested with him were indeed guilty of planning treason and so on and so forth, executing it and as the allegations went. Now, history has it that as soon as the Supreme Court delivered its judgment, and everybody stood up in excitement, as they walked out of that courtroom, they were picked up again, this time without any charges, thrown into detention endlessly from 1993, so 1983, up to the 11th of March 1986, when Mr. Lookout Masuku was released in a very bad state of health by that time. Now, so the issue of Masuku then raises quite a number of questions, because by the time they were detained, this time after the acquittal by the Supreme Court, that was a time when the Kukura operations were all over, Matabeleland in the Midlands. So another question is, was the detention of Masuku and Dabengwa and others just an isolated incident, or it was part of the wider Kukura plot? So it goes on from 1983 to 1986, they are in prison until Mr. Masuku is, as I have said, discharged from that detention, but in a very bad state of health, taken to Paranato Hospital, and then dies just 2 days before his 46th birthday. So that is what happened to him. But now, some people would say he died at the hands of those that he had empowered, because he had fought and won a war against the colonial system. And then he ushered in a new government, which would not have ascended that throne of authority had it not been for the military firepower and the command that Mr. Masuku gave. So then the question is Zimbabwe a nation that expresses its gratitude to those that have sponsored it by way of imprisoning them and subjecting them to all forms of torture? Are we living in a society characterized by paradoxes, whereby those that have done so well to us, we gratuitously torture? Look at the paradox and the contradiction within what we do and how we do things. Those are the issues that we want to reflect on. So I asked the question to say whether their arrest was an isolated incident or it was part of a wider ground plot. Because you see, Mr. Masuku and Dabengwa's arrest, detention, and acquittal and detention again is a textbook example of a travesty of justice, where a court of law pronounces that someone is not guilty of an offense, but the executive overrides the judiciary. So later on in 2025, when people complain that the relationships or the functions and roles of the executive judiciary as well as the legislature are blurred and overlapping, the question is it a new phenomenon or it has always been part and parcel of the culture of Zimbabwe? So why should we expect a disentanglement of the judiciary and the executive in 2025 if we could not have mastered it in 1980? So we are talking here about the issue of justice. It is justice for Lookout Masuku, which was denied him in 1983. But that was just a tip of the iceberg. In fact, it was a sign of what was yet to come. Because many others have gone the same route. We've had many detentions without trial ever since. We have had people waiting for over a year just to appear in court and be granted bail. I'm sure we all remember the story of Job Scar, how he went there without trial for over a year. And we still have an incarceration of journalists, even as we talk today. We have a young man who's still out there not facing trial as he's supposed to, in spite of what the Constitution says, in spite of what the Criminal Procedure Act says, that when a person is suspected of committing an offense, it is legitimate for the police to arrest them, but they must be brought to trial within 48 hours to appear in court and to be charged and to be given the right to apply for bail and so on and so forth. But we know that for the average person in this country, that right only exists in the textbook of law or in the statutes and nowhere outside of that. But that has been the reality for as long as we have been living in Zimbabwe. So talking then about justice, we are looking at the fact that, you see, justice was denied to Lookout Masuku and Provoking. But there are many others to the tune of 20,000 and even more who were killed in cold blood between 1982 and 1987. The date may be very controversial, but we all know the story. We sit at home with our mothers, with our sisters, with our aunties who were raped. Even today, they have not spoken about their stories. We have children that were born, some of them are our nephews and nieces, who were products of that rape, sponsored by the state. But up to this day, those women have never told their story. They sit with children who daily traumatize them, asking them where or who their fathers are. Ubaba wami ngubani? But umama akakwazi ukuthi uzothi uyise womntwana ngubani. Ngoba uyise womntwana kwakungumgugula wonke wafika ekhaya. This is the nature of the society that we are living. Men and women whose souls are tormented with scars from those years way back then. There is still no justice. Still, people cannot talk about it openly without fear of intimidation and without fear of abductions and so on. So that then becomes the major question of whether we are going to expect any justice on these matters or not. So then we are looking at Mr. Lookout Masuku within the context of whether he was a victim or he became a victim. But Mr. Masuku is taken in this case metaphorically as representing all of us here. Because we are Lookout Masuku and he is us. Because he went into war to defend us. He went into war because he was one of us. And then he came back from war as a victor with hope and with optimism. And they became the second high command, second office in the military of this country. But he was snatched away and thrown into detention and died a pauper, a helpless man in isolation. And then I'm sure we all remember the story, the speech by the late Joshua Mkabugo, Dr. Mkabugo, when he said, heroism is not given to us by anybody, but people can only recognize that we are heroes or we are not. So in the case of Mr. Lookout Masuku, who was buried at the Lady Stanley Cemetery, was not accorded the hero status, even though there were no questions about his contribution to this, to the liberation of this country. Even after the fact, one would say 39 years after the death of Lookout Masuku, history has acquitted him. We all know that this whole story about dissidents and so on was just stage managed, it was choreographed, it was just used as a gimmick to just come and harass and terrorize the people. So history has acquitted him, but sadly, he's still been deprived of the honor that should have been given to him. So there has not been justice in life, neither has there been justice in death for him. Because posthumously, he still carries the tag of a dissident leader. Even though those who tormented him knew very well that he was not a dissident leader. Confronted at some point, they claimed that it had been a moment of madness, but never admitted who had been made during that time. And the question still remains. So then, fast forward to the present day, we have planned what are called Kukurahundi hearings. They are planned to take place under the supervision and the supervision of chiefs. And there are a lot of questions that are being raised around the capacity of the chiefs, the competence of the chiefs, as well as their eligibility to be the one holding this kind of talks. So issues of justice still remain to be answered. For instance, there are two principles of justice that are almost recognized as universal. There is the first principle that they call in Latin audi alteram partem, which basically means when there is a conversation, you must hear the other side. You must hear what the other person has got to say. Because whenever there are two people having a disagreement, usually you find, or rather almost all the time, there are two sides to it. So the issue of audi alteram partem, which means hear the other side, must be part of this process. If it is a case of saying, let's hear the other side of the story, which then basically means the victims of Kukurahundi will have to talk in the presence of those chiefs, if that's the process that we are going to follow. So it's going to be accounts from the victims, But you see, a victim can't just talk about how he was victimized. In case he begins to lie and exaggerate, we must also hear the voice of the perpetrator. Because we must be fair, not only to the victim, but we must be fair to the perpetrator as well. So, is it possible to have a fair process where the perpetrator is not given an opportunity to talk, but only the victim does? I will leave that for you to think and decide. But from my own point of view, both the victim and the perpetrator must be part of this process. They must both share their own sides. For instance, from the perpetrator, we want to understand why Ground was sent and unleashed in the first place. Was there a justification for it? Even though, as we sit here, me and you, we may have our own views, whether it was justified or not justified. But the issue is, in terms of the law, the perpetrator must come and explain whether that was necessary or not. What motivated him or her to do what he or she did. So I said there are two principles. So the first one is, let us hear the other side. A very fundamental principle that we cannot operate without. So we talk about these two as cardinal principles of justice. They are so indispensable, you can't do without them. And the next one, they express it in a very long Latin phrase, which maybe let me desist from sharing. But it simply means you cannot be a judge or a presiding office in a matter that is of interest to you, because that's likely to occasion some bias. So in simple terms in Latin, you could just find it by way of nemo judex, just nemo, N-E-M-O, then judex is J-U-D-E-X. That nemo judex principle. It says no one should be a presiding officer in a matter where they have an interest in terms of the outcome. So then the question is, this a process that is being presided over by chiefs. Who has instituted it? Who has decided how the process must proceed? Is there any one of the people who may be suspects because of their involvement or perceived involvement in Guguraum, who then have been very instrumental in designing this process, as well as appointing the very chiefs that must preside over it? For instance, I want you to take a very wild act of imagination where these chiefs who are going to preside actually are appointed by someone, whether in an official or in an individual capacity, whose name is mentioned as a potential perpetrator. Should then that process be seen to be transparent? Should it be seen to be the right vehicle to deliver justice? Because again, one of the questions that often comes up is, we've heard so much about what the government is prescribing and suggesting when it comes to this process. But then the question is, what is the victim saying? Have we asked the questions regarding how the victim himself or herself wants the matter resolved? I spoke about people who lost loved ones, fathers and mothers or kids. I spoke about people who were rape victims. I spoke about people who lost their limbs, they are maimed even today, they can't walk, they can't do anything for themselves. They are literally cabbage. Now, have we heard from them in terms of how they would want this matter to be resolved, since it involves them, their lives, and so much about them? Those are the questions that must be answered. Because without the answering of those questions, we are likely to create or come up with a program which will just window dress the problem instead of addressing it. For instance, we have had claims that when Dr. Joshua Nkomo and Mr. Robert Mugabe signed a unity accord in 1987, they were resolving the Kukurahundi problem. The question is, if it was resolved, why are we talking about it today? And another question is, was Dr. Joshua Nkomo qualified to make a decision about a person like myself who may be a victim one way or the other? Was Mr. Nkomo endowed with the capacity to decide about my pain? That's a very critical question. Was Mr. Mugabe endowed with the capacity to, just wash away the experience and the trauma of rape that somebody at a village in Lupane experienced? Were they capacitated in that way? Is it sufficient for them as leaders of political parties to decide about the appropriate solution and remedy that affects so many millions of people? Were the people consulted? Those are critical questions that we need to ask. And there are many other questions to do with who is a victim of Kukurahundi. Is it only those who were shot at and lost their limbs? Is it only those who were raped? Is it only those whose parents or children were killed? Is it only those who were alive during that period? Is it possible to have somebody who was born in 2019 who is a victim of Kukurahundi? Have we defined what a victim is? Maybe as we sit here, every one of us has different views about what a victim is. So, as we approach this process, have we defined these roles? Are we sure who we are expecting to hear from? And have we made provision for the victims, whoever they are, to express themselves? And what are supposed to be the consequences of this process? So at the end of the day, we know that data is going to be collected. And so what? I'm sure we had Babu Fuzo talking about the answer that was given by the Speaker of Parliament and so on. Those are the questions that we should be engaging. And the question is, as we are, as the communities of Matabele and the Midlands, do we have a common position about how this thing must be resolved? Are we the ones to determine how it must be resolved? And another question is, we have people in Ndale, people in Wonde Valley, people in Mazoe, people in Chirundu. If they are Zimbabweans themselves, as they always claim to be, and just like the rest of us this side, do they have an interest in these processes? Is it within their rights to ask questions about this? Are they victims of it themselves, even though they have not stayed here? Is it possible that somebody in Chirundu or somebody at Mazoe is also a victim, even though he was not in Matabele during that time? Those are some of the questions that we need to talk about. And how about the millions of the people who have been displaced, who were displaced during the time of the active ground years, and even in its mutated forms, because people have continued to be displaced from this city. Remember, some people have argued, I don't know what you think about this, but they have said that the years 1983 to 87 were active Kukuraundi years, but then it mutated and took different forms. Now it still exists in a different form, in a subterranean form, underground. But its impact is not less hazardous than the original one. So, is it then correct to say genocide has continued immaterially from 1983 to the present day? Because we have people who continue to be pushed because they are sidelined, excluded when it comes to job opportunities, business opportunities, and so on and so forth. And the place becomes uninhabitable for them. Then they go out into other countries to look for means to survive. Are they going out because of genocide in Kukuraundi? That's why I was asking whether it's possible that somebody who was born in 2019 could be a victim of Kukuraundi. Because if he's born somewhere in the flat of Hillbrook, born to a mother and a father who do not have birth certificates, because their parents did not get birth certificates here, since the deaths of their own parents had not been confirmed. So that baby born in Hillbrook, Johannesburg, who cannot obtain a birth certificate, then that person becomes stateless. Because as long as they can't obtain birth certificates from any country, they will become stateless. So do we then have this problem being projected way into the future so that it will affect even those not yet born? Those are some of the questions to think about. So that's as far as the Kukuraundi process is concerned. That's as far as the principles of justice or lack of justice are concerned. We spoke about those two principles and we want to see them applied. Because if we don't apply those principles, then surely we cannot expect to have redressed the issue of Kukuraundi. But we are not talking about Kukuraundi. We are talking about Mr. Lookout Masuku and what his experience symbolizes. We said that it symbolizes a travesty of justice. It symbolizes this indifference towards justice, whereby I did give a few examples when I spoke about Job Scala and the Blessing Krana. Those incidents are not happening here, but they are happening across Zimbabwe. And the issue is they are taking on the same fashion and the same pattern that Mr. Lookout Masuku faced. So his case was just a starting point, and it just gave us a glimpse into what would happen in the future. That's why not so long ago there was this debate that incensed the powers that be. They got so agitated and irritated when youngsters started asking questions whether life under Smith regime was better than what it is now. Now, you may not begrudge the young people, I can see a lot of them here, for asking that question. War veterans, with due respect, I saw your work, I'm very proud of what you did. But your children and grandchildren are asking questions to say, was the war that you fought worth the effort that you gave to it? Because they have become victims of a system that you inaugurated. Do you blame them for seeing you as accomplices in this crime and felony that has driven them out of their own homeland? Do you begrudge them for accusing them, for having condemned them into this state of statelessness where they live as foreigners? Behamba kweminye imizi ngoba ekhaya kungahlaleki.
Wenela.
Yafana newenela. Mhlawumbe umuntu uzothi mama nina nanihambe wenela ngoba izwe lani ngakhululekanga. Sebeyelani ewenela abantwana namhlanje.
Alikhululekanga.
Bamethi izwe alikhululekanga kanti ubaba uMasuku akalilethanga yini lo esihlangene ngaye lapha. Akalilethanga yini izwe ubaba uMasuku. These are questions that we always have to grapple with every now and again. Because the young people are beginning not to see any benefit in your efforts. Because with due respect, our war veterans are a generation that breaks about its own experiences and its own accomplishments. But when your child or grandchild is sitting in those flats somewhere in Johannesburg and is being arrested every now and again for not having the formal papers to stay in that country, then that child has a reason to believe that your involvement in that war was just an act of misplaced priorities. Now, let's look at Mr. Masuku, not in him as the man that died in 1986, but let's talk about his own son, his own daughter. Let's talk about his own grandson, his own granddaughter. When those children are strewn all over the world, do they have every reason to take pride in the work and the achievements of Masuku? Or they should look at him as somebody who ushered them into a very sad scenario whereby his efforts and work have condemned them to further trouble, as one would say. So, when you think about that, you then think about the future of the country. Where is the country going? If the young stars are beginning to question your function and your role and your achievements in that struggle, then the question is, so why did you prosecute it? So then the question comes, are you victors or you are victims of the war that you fought? Maybe another question is, when you went to war, when Mr. Masuku went to war, did he know, did he clearly envision the kind of Zimbabwe that he wanted? And did he eventually get it? If he did get it, then surely it is a very sad picture that we see. But if he did not get it, then what was the effort all about? And maybe another question would be, then what next? So these are very critical questions that we need to, because you see, the way the young person in Zimbabwe understands independence matters. Because whilst our fathers and mothers and our grandfathers speak about their efforts and their contributions and the sacrifices that they made, surely the children should be able to look back and say, my grandfather or my grandmother made a sacrifice and I'm reaping the fruits of it. But if that same child is living in abject poverty and statelessness, for that matter, then surely there is no point in the war having been fought. So the question is, should we be proud of the work and the efforts of our fathers and mothers during that liberation struggle? These are questions that I ask not because I have answers to, but like I said earlier, I'm trying to provoke the reflection. If we can all reflect on this, it will then help us, to shape ourselves and constitute ourselves into a better nation and a better country and a better community than we currently are. Because there are so many unanswered questions about Zimbabwe. I think one of them that I can just mention as I round up is the question of Zimbabweanness. Who is a Zimbabwean? How many of you know a Zimbabwean? If I could ask you to tell me what a Zimbabwean is, do you know what it is? Are you a Zimbabwean as you sit here? Raise your hand if you are one. Okay. Raise your hand if you are Zimbabwean. Oh, raise your hand if you don't know whether you are one or not. Okay. Now, it's yes, sir. You are not sure whether you are one or not.
I am.
You are one. So what is it?
A Zimbabwean is somebody. Well, in my case, I'm a Zimbabwean in the sense that I was born in Zimbabwe, and I do have all the requirements according to law that would require me to be a Zimbabwean, like the normal identity documents. I was born here. I got no other home.
Okay, is it about identity documents and the geographical place where one was born? Or it should go beyond that?
It can, but in my case I narrowed it to that because I think it fits me well there. All these other descriptions now outside, they only serve to raise my case more.
What are some of the possible descriptions?
One can be a Zimbabwean by virtue of, even if born outside in terms of geography, but the roots, the parents and the like are originally from Zimbabwe.
Okay, thank you, sir, for raising that. Well, an interesting question would be, these war veterans were born here and they had a Rhodesian identity document. So why did they go out to fight? Was nobody contested the fact that geographically this was their place of birth. So why did they go out to fight? Because I'm sure they can all confirm, those who were there, that they had ID documents, they had been born here. Nobody ever described them as foreigners, but they went to fight to bring Zimbabwe in, to usher Zimbabwe in. So what were they fighting for? So do we then narrow being Zimbabwean just to this civil, what's called civil registry data, like your surname, your first name, your what's called ID number and so on? Or there should be something more to it? Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Wefaka nzima kakhulu.
Okay.
Yonke lemibuzo osijikela yona lawe singawujikela ngeke uyiphendule. Mana phela mbijana, the reason why ungelazi impendulo ukuthi lathi asinazo impendulo, because like Usibanda is saying, abantu define Zimbabweans by i-constitution yezwe, i-documents esizithwalayo lapho esizalelwe khona. But lowo mbuzo obuzayo wena is deeper than that. Do I feel I belong? That is your question. The situation yezwe nabaphathi abaphethe izwe bangenza ngizizwe ngingaphandle ngifana lo mzukulu okhulele lapha ekhaya kodwa indlela engiphatheke ngayo ingenza ngingazizwa ngumntwana walapha kodwa mina ngiwala yiyo umbuzo wakho lapho yakhona because kunjalo sikulecture lapha ka comrade Lookout Masuku kasingeke sikuphendule ngendlela ofuna sikuphendule ngayo
asibona nangubaba lapha
Sahamba sayawula we-40 the legitimate character of the regime which was ruling us. It was imposing its will on the majority. Sibone ukuthi laphana abantu abakhulu babe 4 million during that time, but abantu who were running who were controlling the levers of the state and controlling our lives, there were 250,000 with a representation of 65 members of parliament in the legislature. And then ngasikhuluma ngokulwa ukuthi sivele kuminjani. Yes, we've achieved independence, but the element of freedom asila. Now si state sesirecognize umhlaba wonke, so the statehood of Zimbabwe, because one of the qualifications for the state is it requires umhlaba wonke ukuthi it should not be controlled by the outsiders or any foreign power. That is ngathi impendulamo ngayifaka khona. So uhlupho silami ayi freedom kasi njengoba sitestata ukukhuluma kuMasuku wayekuraise ngo1980 ukuthi siyakha isizwe mhlobane nxa sihamba ngalolu nyawo.
Yabonga kakhulu baba. Yebo ukuthi
ukuzinjani ukuze umphendule umbuzo wakho ukuthi aweZimbabweaness
sengukhohli. Hayi ngibeka.
Ngizathi ngeke ibali singalifaka nabo acceptability.
Okay.
Ngizakuma khona.
Acceptability. Hayi siyabonga kakhulu. Yebo baba.
Yeah. I think it's a police challenge about.
Yeah.
The first thing I think is in the financial level is Zimbabwe now while young in Jangelis. You finally jail. You cannot go to prison, you know, city, so this is exactly where we are. Amalungelo awenza ukuthi ube ngumuntu ngawekho ikamela phansi. Kodwa uhlezi khona phansi ekamela phansi. So this is where we are. The fiscal structure is defined, ayisikhona. Kodwa kuningi owenza ukuthi ngase sithi uzizwe siba ngumZimbabwean. Kulokunye ufaka ukuthi kube khona kunonke ukuhlonishwa amalungelo okunomunye okuthize. Yizo izinto ezingekho ekame prison lapha. Yikho mesizwe.
Yebo baba umthimbu.
Siyabonga lecturer is i-question complex kodwa ifanele nayo. So probably i-general perception ithi yona there is no freedom. Ngingalalela uzilethu bakuJoshua Nkomithi wafunda very late ukuthi one can attain independence but suffer from having freedom. Nxa singathwala define ngamaZimbabwe or something else, it would be very difficult for Lookout Masuku to say is Zimbabwe called. What we are saying, are we Zimbabweans? No, there is no Zimbabwe yet. Ngoba kasila freedom. But if you went to any African country today, 25, they celebrate Africa, you find Mswaziland. Mswati is enjoying to be a Swati in Swaziland. Lesotho, Zambian will be enjoying to say, but look out here, so there's no such country. So I don't know if I'm a Zimbabwean or something else.
Thank you. Yebo.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity. Ukala ngibonga ne deliverance lecture le.
It was very, very mind-opening. Well researched, I would say. Maybe the only mistake was you referring to General without Masuku as Minister.
I stand corrected.
I'm a traditionalist. As a traditionalist, I think very much our company say this part of Ngapaliti is Zimbabwe. Moba nanzeli emuva lebi ngongela sasinashanga nangalawana nabangani. So kimi kulula ukuthi ngiphendele umuntu. I mean personally I may be holding a document but I'm not a Zimbabwean. Mina ngumthwakazi baba. Ngafoselwa ukuthi ngibe ngumZimbabwean. I'm ambiguous about that. I'm hesitate what these people say. I'm not a Zimbabwean. These documents will never make me who I am. I believe it was a move what was happening. Maybe it was a mistake which is strong Nabangani. You want to go to esikhambe nela notice ngababadala bahle basehlukanisa ngabasibona
Siyabonga baba, siyabonga. Ngeke sizogcina kodwa ke cishe ngabona isandla. Yebo
Lapha, I think I would like to thank Ibhetshu likaZulu usihlanganisa as they've done before. I know too before 2016 uDawengo wacela ukuthi azekhuluma ngoMangena Masuku on the same day. I think if we do that, we should do that. Sehlukanise futhi the African Union, which is today, 25 May, is actually Africa Freedom Day. And so when we hlukane lo ngoba, for example, we have to say, okay, he was the first president of Zambia, but oyise bavele eMalawi baya eZambia, waba president weZambia, wayeqalisa as a country is Zambia. Now, that is equivalent of our country ngapha iZimbabwe eyakhiwa ngapha kweZambia. Now, if that is the case, then we have to say iZambia yazama ukuhlangana. Kwaba nama-rules ayikhulunywa kwaba. But nasavela le kulozi savela umthwana asisiwo maZambia laba abantu bokuze sabafika la. Therefore, it has to be another question. Ukuthi iAfrica Freedom Day isihamba njani thina la. Abanye bethu ababekhona la, for example, abazojeva Maseko. You would say alwana ngumZambia. Uba umZambia kwakusitshona. Abanye bahamba lapho bezimenzwa ngendaba evela leSouth. Now, do we say sinabe South, besingabalapha yikho salwela lapho? And then beyond that, leli lizwe kwakuzana. Umuntu ohlezi lapho within the boundary. Zimbabwe was supposed to be a place where everybody was equal, including Akiwa Azalela. In 1957, for example, the African National Congress, Yakokelo Mkom Oala, the African National Congress in South Africa of 54 or some time. So does that make us a particular country? We say we move. Ukweza ukuthi ukudlula kwengikucina ngo-1893 bisola yiko leli lizwe lama-central banks eHarare leyala kule central bank la kule state house la. Does that make us a different part of the country? If so, then yiko lokho kwenza ukuthi kuzanywe lakhathesi ukuthi kuhlangane. That's why in 2013 the National Peace and Reconciliation Council a part of the commissions set up by the law Zimbabwe. It was supposed to be only for a few years. So we chiefs we raise constitutions the National Peace and Reconciliation Commission. Yeah. Now, can you really deal with that separate for the future? But
guys, thank you very much. As I began by saying, first of all, let me appreciate all the different views that have been shared here. They are all very eye-opening views. Hey, Mom, that's the name of the truth. Still sikhulume sashimbo kodwa ngaphandle.
Ngiyabonga sinizami kuba khona lapha emhlanganweni. Mina ngisuka ngibele ukuthi sika ukuthi ngokuba ngabe ngizimbabwe kumbe yini nxa sonke singamaZimbabwe ngiyakubona ukuthi likaZulu Masuku wahliwa kuholo siphathana njani ngoba nxa sonke singamaZimbabwe asiphathaneni njengamaZimbabwe silingane asilingani.
Siyabonga kakhulu.
Mina ngithi asilingani ngizasukela kudala mbijana ngesikhathi segugu lawo. Sasithi nxa sihlezi emhlanganweni so kuthiwe ama-dissidents angazaphendula la. It's a professional meeting for what? Ngiyi-dissident ngesibongo. Ngiyi-dissident ngokuthi ngivela ngaphi. Nxa kukhulunywa ngathi yaphendula ukuthi ama-dissident angeme la. It's a professional meeting. Akeme sikhulume thina. Bakhulume. Lize lidevelophe ukuzithulela. Udabezi. Bese ngisiba lenhlanhla. Nge-issue yenu njalo ekuground elikhuluma ngayo. Sengisiye eParliament. Kusukunywe kuchaye zona ingoma zodwa. Ngibuze ngelinye ilanga. Ngithi zinindani. Asisekho ground khathesi. Nxa likhumbula sibili ukukhulunywa ngoground eParliament. Iqalise ngeParliament ka-2013. Isiyabo iye yaqalisa ukuthi eParliament discuss. Ngathi mina nxa likhuluma yonke into likhuluma ngathi kwalwa njokukhulumile izandla yodwa. Sikwenzelani khonoko? Ngathi mina izandla kayilisanga ifremachine wakhe. Uyazi bahlela ngoba it was not a usual thing. Kodwa msisikhuluma ukhuluma into njalo. Ngathi phela yonke into likhuluma ngathi mina le kwenziwe izandla yenza yonke into. Iziframe ngazi ukuthi yiye yawo isifremachine. I-recognition yakho ngathi mina ongabantwana selikuthengele okuyizinto lokho. One day they will go and say, Baba wakungitshela manga usithi. Engikutsho ukuthi izinzana khathesi asisodwa esiphakathi kobuhlungu. Lokhu ngabantwana kwabo. They are also in difficulties. Bayakubona ukuthi kwakhulunywa manga. Kulezi insuku lalibazwela labo bekhuluma abantwana. Kodwa ngayitsho le nto eParliament. Ngathi abantwana benu bazakwazi ukuthi ubaba banamanga. Basitshela amanga ngoba they will Google and know. That was after 2 weeks kwa-announced ukuthi izipra yawo isifremachina ngathi uvala inkulumo yami nxa nifuna abantu bevele phakathi issues zeParliament. That one I raised. Amanga asiwayekeleni lathi singazisakhuluma amanga. Sikhuluma iqiniso. Sibabonge lo ngabafana bakuthunywa ukuhambisa izimpahla ebhodi eZambia eLupane. They are part of likaZulu Masuku. Ngoba labo babengahlali babephakathi kwezindlu. Sikhuluma ngathi yonke into sikukhumbula ukuthi lo ngabantwana bekuthi nami 4 years eEngland. Wathi eseNgilandi wachaya umntana ekhiwa ngakuzwa ngalelo la. Athi ngokungabantwana 4 years umntana ukuthi maka akwazi sekusithi useZimbabwe kwalibamba bazabamba bathi wenzani. Unfortunately kwakuno-teacher olengqondo wathi kwabona amakhiwa kwenza kibo yikho ukuthi ikhiwa yi-enemy sekubamba kuqinisa, but we will have to teach lingakusoli kakhulu ngomntwana engikutsho ukuthi singaze siqamba amanga sithini one day kuzaphuma into kalokhantu Masuku abantwana bethu laba every child olalinto bayagugula these days from all parts of the country. They know the truth. Ngiyabonga baba okusikhatshana.
Siyabonga kakhulu. Thank you very much, Mrs. Kumar. Right, ladies and gentlemen, we have received so many responses from different views and different points of view. When I asked the question, I didn't know what answer to expect. But some interesting views were raised.